A lot of very, very smart people like Andy Ross is a literary agent, and he knows the book business inside and out. And he's actually mentored people a little bit in this program, but his primary job, of course, is being a dad, actually. But his other primary job is being a literary agent. That is his role in the world, and he'll probably mention that a little bit in his talk. He's going to be in conversation with Erik Tarloff, author of All Our Yesterdays, who's sitting right here. Erik is an accomplished screenwriter. He's written for television, movies, but he's also written a best-selling and a couple of critically acclaimed and a best-selling book. And now he has, utilizing the Path to Publishing program and of course his own great writing skills, produced this wonderful novel that they're going to talk about today, All Our Yesterdays. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Andy Ross and Erik Tarloff.
Thank you, Sam. Well, we're going to just have kind of a nice conversation today about All Our Yesterdays, which it has been said is the best novel ever written about Berkeley, and which I completely agree with. And you can decide for yourselves at the end of this event. I thought maybe we could start out, Erik, by just reading a short portion of it.
Okay, the first 75 pages.
It's like you know Bloomsday or something.
Someday they'll be doing that. Okay, I'll just try to situate it very quickly. This takes place, this scene in 1972, election night, 1972, and the protagonist and his best friend, his nerdy best friend Stanley, are at Spenger's drowning their sorrows because they know how the evening's going to turn out. They're 22, 23 years old by now, and they've come across somebody they went to elementary and high school with but haven't seen in the ensuing years. She is with a group of people, one of whom is her boyfriend, and she's come over to join these two because she's just had a fight with her boyfriend. And when we start, she has just said something disparaging about his sexual skills. At which point, David himself appeared. A good-looking guy, genus wasp, in his upper 20s, red blonde hair, short and neatly parted. This was an era when hair was a declaration of principle, with a frown on his square-jawed face. He was wearing a navy blue blazer and grayish plaid slacks, a white shirt, a blue and red rep tie. Grotesquely wide, but that was the fashion. It wasn't his fault. Ditto his ungainly sideburns. I had them too, but at least I had the Ashkenaz fro to match. He stood watching us for a moment, forcing a very forced smile. I don't believe he heard what she just said. He reached our table too late, at least I hope he did. But he couldn't have missed the hilarity, which was ongoing when he arrived, and from which he had to have felt excluded. He finally nodded to Stan and me, unsure, I think, whether to regard us as enemies or not, and so granting us provisional but minimal courtesy, and then turned to Melanie. We're getting ready to go, he said. Tell everyone good night for me, she said, and polished off her glass of beer in one impressive chug. He reacted with concern as well as annoyance. Melanie, he said. I don't feel like leaving yet, she announced flatly. He looked from Melanie to Stan to me and back to Melanie, thwarted, puzzled about what was happening and how to react, and no doubt about how ridiculous he was being made to look. Finally he said, can I talk to you alone for a minute? She was pouring herself another glass of beer. Haven't you had enough to drink? The frown was back on his face, the forced smile no longer enforceable. You're telling me you intend to stay with these two characters, he demanded. Hey, said Stanley, I'm not a character. Melanie laughed. Stan looked over at her with pleased surprise. He hadn't meant to be funny, but she found it funny, and now they were allies. So he laughed too. I didn't. I was starting to feel queasy about this transaction. Not because I'm a saint, and not because I found anything about David to like. His calling Stan and me characters was gratuitous, calculatedly rude. But still, I'd recently been humiliated by the woman I loved, and in a sufficiently public manner, all my friends knew the particulars, that I'd felt belittled as well as injured. I know what that feels like. I was still experiencing it afresh, keenly, every waking moment. Several times a day, in the midst of doing something unrelated and unremarkable, I'd find myself almost literally paralyzed with grief and mortification, unable to function, unable to concentrate. So I hesitated about colluding with Melanie to inflict anything similar on anyone else, regardless of where fault lay or where my loyalties belonged. "Shut up," David now said to Stan. That complicated the picture. "Look," I said, "cool down, okay? Butt the fuck out." He wasn't making it easy to be a good Samaritan, but I still hoped to smooth things over. My impulse was to invite him to sit down and have a beer, but it wasn't my invitation to proffer, not with Melanie there. Despite that restriction, I gave it one more try. "You might want to reassess the situation. Stan and I are old high school chums of Melanie's, and we haven't seen her in a long time. You don't have a beef with us, and we don't have one with you. There isn't any call to be obnoxious." He flashed me a look of pure, withering contempt. The contempt of a blonde wasp in a suit for two younger swarthies in scruffy clothing. In his own mind, his superiority was patent. Everything in his manner proclaimed it. He didn't deign to answer me. Instead, he addressed Melanie. "Enough of this bullshit, Mel. It's time to go." He used that peculiarly masculine tone combining menace with wheedling entreaty. The menace sounding the dominant note, of course. Under the table, Melanie put a hand on my upper thigh. That introduced a new bit of complexity, although it wasn't visible to anyone else. "No," she said, "I thought I'd made myself clear. I'm staying. Good night, David." "Because I made a couple of jokes?" "Whatever. I really think you'd better come with me." He was dialing up the menace a perceptible tad. "Nope." He put his hands on the table and leaned in. "Maybe you didn't hear me." It was liberating, his insistence on being a complete asshole. It gave me the freedom to scrap my remaining scruples. I was drunk enough, provoked enough, and, this isn't something I'm proud of, emboldened enough by that hand on my thigh to rise to the bait. "Melanie's given you her answer, pal," I said. I almost ruined the effect by giggling, barely checking myself in time. It's just I had never in my life called anyone pal before. Not at least in that Warner Brothers tough guy way. He looked at me, shifted his weight toward me. Suddenly there was blood in the air. You absolutely, positively could feel it. We primates are wired to feel it. "You telling me what to do?" he demanded. It was the wrong time to push me. The wrong night and the wrong season. I had too much rage in me to feel much in the way of fear. I stood up, dislodging Melanie's hand. Keeping my voice low, I said, "If you want to turn this into something between you and me, be my guest. There's no reason to, but I'm willing." Another primate moment. The tables around us grew quiet. Adrenaline travels. He stared at me, assessing my willingness to see this through, gauging my implausible capacity for mayhem. He may even have been considering the relative value of his blazer versus my flannel shirt. It was like a poker game. What cards are you holding? When do you stop raising? Which of you is bluffing? He was the one to blink. I had had an instinct he would be. He flushed, said, "Eat shit," and turned on his heel and withdrew. "Not exactly Noel Coward," I said as I resumed.
The whole book isn't that funny. Actually, there is no book that funny, now that I think about it. Could you just describe very briefly what this book really is about?
Sure. It's a sort of generational book. It takes a group of friends who meet in the environs of 1968, and it follows their development through to the present, and how their relationships change, and what threatens it, and what reinforces it, and so on. And it takes us through to pretty much today.
You know, what's interesting to me is, the creative process. And I know that what my writing abilities sort of ended with describe and give the significance of.
Oh, that's lacking in my book.
So, I mean,
for the next edition.
How did you think of this whole story? I mean, it's a complicated story. Did you just wake up in the middle of the night? I mean, how did it all come to
actually, it was a slightly complex process in that I wrote a scene all in isolation without any notion of what it was or what it connected to. And I liked it, but I didn't have any idea what it was, and I filed it away. It's on page 24. It starts on page 24. And then about a year later, I started writing this, and I suddenly realized that scene actually fit perfectly into the scheme. But because it's a rather intricate novel, I mean, we have a bunch of different stories on a time frame which travels over 40 years.
It goes then and now is kind of the...
Yeah, I was just going to say, it alternates. The chapters alternate between the present and the past, with the past slowly catching up to the present. And this makes it sound more complicated to read than it is. I think it's actually rather straightforward.
I read it, the first time I read it in two days. I stayed up. That's the platinum standard for,
2 days, that's the yardstick.
Yeah, it took me 3 days to read Ulysses.
Anyway, I alternate first person and third person, and I'm not quite sure why, but the past chapters are in the first person and the present chapters are in the third person. And I think there's probably an advantage to it, but if I explained it now, it would be absolutely ex post facto. I didn't think analytically about it, I just did it. It was because it was complicated to plot, and because I believe in plot, I actually worked with 3x5 cards and a cork board and everything, just to make sure that every strand sort of fit and everybody was taken care of in every chapter. But is that what you were asking?
More or less. I was thinking about this when I read it, that to me it really captured Berkeley in the 60s more than anything I've read. And then I was thinking about that there are these sort of iconic books for every period. Like, I think if you said what was the great book of the 20s, a large number of people would say The Great Gatsby. And similarly, in the 30s, it might be a little more complicated, but you probably wouldn't disagree if I said it was The Grapes of Wrath. And probably in the 40s it was some war novel, but I don't know which one. And I think, I just don't know of anything like that in the 60s. What do you think about that?
I think probably the iconic books from the 60s wouldn't be fiction. I mean, I would think something by Tom Wolfe, perhaps.
The Electric Kool-Aid
Like
Acid
the Electric
Test.
Kool-Aid
Yeah.
Acid Test. Or maybe one of Norman Mailer's nonfiction books.
Okay. Any novels that you can think of?
Well,
Other than war novels.
I think all the four Rabbit novels, but I think the first one was in the 50s, and the third one was in the 70s.
So why? Why are they emblematic of that period?
I just think Updike was so in touch with the zeitgeist, and he's so incorporated into the consciousness of his protagonist, that pretty much, if you want to know about those decades, reading those books will tell you.
What about books about Berkeley?
I don't know any.
You don't have, well, there are some.
Except this one.
Actually, I'm sending out one next week.
No,
but
but somebody said this was the best book ever written.
it has been said. The best book ever written. It has been said, for sure. Except my experience I got to bring this up because everybody I know thought that this was a Romana Clef, and you are vehemently denying it. And when I read it, all I could see was you. So will you please, for the record?
Yes. I'll tell you one thing which will buttress my case at least. One of my oldest friends, a friend from age 13 who I've known throughout, said he picked it up and read it looking for himself and our mutual friends. And he said at a certain point I realized none of them were in it. It was just not, it was not autobiographical. And it isn't. And there's no way when you write in the first person, some of your own voice isn't going to sneak in to the prose style. I mean, I can't deny that. But the events in it are not real. And I would, without going into great detail here, I could differentiate between me and the protagonist, I think, pretty thoroughly. I think he's probably a better person than I am.
One of the things that mostly what I remember about the 60s, we're about the same. Actually, we both went to Brandeis. You for a year, me for.
I got the hell out.
Wise.
That's how you got to Berkeley.
That's how I got to
But mostly what I remember is kind of a druggy haze about. I mean, that's what the 60s meant to me. And drugs do not play a big part in this book.
No.
They enter into it a bit, but they're not a major.
Yeah, Molly had a few experiences, but it really isn't part of the story. It sort of happens off stage.
Well, I would say, except for people who got really sort of very, very seriously into drugs, it wasn't necessarily a central part of one's life. It was a recreation. I mean, I certainly smoked my share of marijuana for a year or two, and dabbled in other things. But I mean, I didn't organize my life around them. They weren't the sort of central emotional facts in my life. So I think that's the sort of role they play here.
But politics plays a very big role in this now. Could you may need to explain the plot a little more. I mean, it's.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
No.
Lord, I won't give it away. Well, it's sort of there's a triangle going on here. There is
You're
Zeke.
giving away too much already?
Well,
Next you're going to say who committed the murder. No,
the butler did it. Well, there's Zeke, who is sort of one of the narrators, who is this, in the 60s, he's just sort of a callow student. And he gets together with Molly, and who is going to get a PhD. And you know,
I'm going to have to stop you. You're going to give away the plot. I don't want you to.
okay, well, there's the third member that I can't ask my question. There's a guy named Corin who is very radical and very narcissistic, and I guess my question about Corin is, does he kind of represent a certain type of political person back then?
Well, I think he represents a certain kind of person, and not only back then. I mean, I think his radicalism has more to do with kind of self-presentation than with an evolved political philosophy, but he's smart enough to couch it in terms of an evolved political philosophy.
What kind of person is he? Am I throwing you hard questions? You said he's a certain kind of a person.
Well, I mean, I think he's a self-dramatizing and rather charismatic person who can command the attention of people in almost any room he finds himself.
He sounds like one of the leaders of the Weathermen or something like that.
Well, I think he probably has something in common with them.
Bill Ayers or someone like that.
Yes, except I don't think he knew Barack Obama.
Certainly never attended the same parties.
Or satyrs, which apparently
They did together. I was actually at a party at Bill Ayers' house, but I won't have to go. That would be another book, or at least another conversation. So how do you feel about? Let's talk about radicalism in the '60s. I mean, does this kind of express your own feelings about it, or what?
I suppose in a way it must. I mean, it was a political era. One was forced to be political because it was literally a matter of life and death. There was a war going on, and any man between the ages of whatever it was, 17 and 35 or something, was at risk. So you couldn't treat this as a theoretical argument. This was a really practical argument in which your survival might well be at stake. So we were all political to that extent. And I think once you think about the Vietnam War, you start thinking about related issues. So yes, it was a very political era, and I don't think it was possible to be divorced from it.
But you know, thinking back on this book, really, I mean, it really goes back and forth between this relationship between Zeke and Molly, and in the that was in the then, and then in the now. All of a sudden they're married. I mean, they break up, and then all of a sudden they're married, and you don't even understand how all that happened. I mean, you really left kind of a cliffhanger there,
Well,
right?
my image of how the book is constructed is as a kind of jigsaw puzzle, in which a piece is put in here, a piece is put here, a piece is put in, and it's only on the last page of the final.
The one in the middle.
It's the one in the middle, and then the whole picture comes together. So.
Fortunately, it isn't like my jigsaw puzzles where there's always the one that's lost. Well, and I, you know, when I thought about it, the first time I read it some years ago, it seemed like more than about Berkeley in the 60s, it was really about kind of how love changes. It was a very, you know, how, you know, kind of was almost a comparison of, you know, of young love, which has got all this power and kind of erotically charged blah blah, and more mature.
Can't live without that.
I've become a cynic there. You know, the blah blah is kind of fun. The
I don't even like the blah blah when it is
the blah blah is
That's how jaded I am.
but also like the more mature, kind of deeper kind of love of the now part. I mean, were you?
Well, you know, if I had to, and I don't like having to say what is the book about, because you know, it's 382 pages, so it's not about one thing. But the opening sentence of the book and the final sentence of the book are both about the continuity or the durability of identity. And I think in some ways the ways in which we change over the decades, and what kernel of us remains the same. That's really the question the book addresses. And in a way, the relationship between Zeke and Molly, I hope, illuminates that question, as do the other sustainable relationships in the book.
And I assume Molly is not autobiographical about Laura either.
No.
Can we
I would say she's even more different from Erik than I am.
Let's talk about some of your other novels, okay?
Sure.
FaceTime. You want to tell the backstory about FaceTime? This was a bestseller book. It came out around 2000, didn't it? Or
Yeah, 1999. I had this idea. Laura and I were living in Washington. Laura was in Clinton's cabinet. And I had an idea for a novel, and I started writing it, and I had a different agent then. Really charming fellow.
I know all about him.
Anyway,
A sarcastic comment.
I was about 40 or 45 pages into this book about the president having an affair with the speechwriter's girlfriend, and then the Monica Lewinsky story broke, and I really was gobsmacked. I didn't know what to do, and I called my charming agent and I said, what should I? He had been reading the pages, so he's also a witness for me that this book preceded the actual scandal. And I said, what should I do? He said, just keep writing. So, and the book was published during the impeachment trial, which I think probably helped sales.
It's sort of axiomatic in the book business that sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart. And my most successful book was by this scholar of North Korea, and the publication date was a week after the new great leader threatened to bomb Hawaii. So we benefited from all of that.
Hawaii wasn't so lucky.
Well, if they did bomb Hawaii, then we'd be talking about big numbers. But
anyway, yes, I was a beneficiary of a horrible scandal.
that's good.
Yeah, I'm delighted.
And your second book was The Man Who Wrote the Book, which some people,
yeah.
it has been said is the funniest contemporary book ever written. You want to talk about that a little bit?
No, what more is there to say?
Let's talk about writing humor, because the part you read is very, very funny. Everybody, responded to it. And The Man Who Wrote the Book is a farce, really. I mean, it's almost like an 18th century kind of farce. And actually, I thought FaceTime was a very funny book too. I thought, I read it so fast that I remember the first time I met you. You came into the store, and I said, I enjoyed this book so much. I bet it was a lot of fun to write. To which you responded, well, actually, it wasn't.
Well, they never are, really. Sometimes in retrospect. I mean, just to revert to this one for a second, I mean, I wrote this when we were living in London, and I think I probably wouldn't have written it if Laura and I hadn't been living in London. I was so homesick for Berkeley that it was a way of walking the streets of Berkeley every morning. I would go to my office and just immerse myself. So this was fun to write, at least in retrospect.
And you've got all the real businesses and the cafes. I noticed there was one business that was conspicuously absent, and that would be Cody's. Was there a reason for that?
Yeah, I hated that book. Cody's was closed in the present part of this. It had already closed. I'm sorry.
People could have still, whined and grind their teeth about it.
No, again, in the second edition.
Yes,
Can I
question.
make a comment?
No, I'm afraid that's right.
It's just what I feel having read the three books, that your ability to portray a man's sensitivity in relationships is something I don't see that often in fiction. And there's lots of fiction written for women, and it's all fine, but I think that the level of the quality of literature is excellent, and then the way you sort of humbly reveal the innermost self of the narrator is just, it's so beautiful and so moving. I mean, I was just so taken with the book and so thrilled finally it can be published, because I was telling people about it for the past 5 years, but I couldn't show it to anybody because I only had it printed out on Word, on text. So I really hope that everybody here who finds it can then give it on to a friend, because it's quite extraordinary, I think.
Any other questions?
They do make excellent gifts.
A wonderful stocking stuffer, by the way. Start early. Yes,
I
sir.
request that he move the microphone a little bit to the side, because I got.
Like this?
Yeah.
There you go.
Proud of yourself? Yeah. Here we go. Okay, I'll hold it.
I want to ask you about writing humor. I always felt that it was much harder to write Twelfth Night than King Lear. I mean, what's it like to write?
Well, I happen to have written both, so. Somebody said, I think it was Sam Berman said, write tragedy and you're the toast of the town, but comedy is a serious business. Comedy is harder. But, the matter of the book was, as you say, an out-and-out farce, and that was meant to be funny, and I wrote that as a comedy. The other two, I think the comedy arises kind of naturally out of the truth of the scenes, and I'm much more interested in being true to the emotions of the characters than in being funny in the other books, but occasionally funny things happen. But I was just going to say, but having actually written sitcoms for about 20 years, I mean, there is a kind of rhythm of setup and joke, which you acquire a kind of facility with it over time. I kind of hate it, but I think I was able to do it when I had to.
Now I do have a question.
Good.
Was you, when you did your note cards, was that from your writing television and film days?
Well, I never did it in television, but I did do it with film. But really, the difference between plotting a movie and plotting a book isn't that different. The process of writing them is very different. But in terms of the structure of a story, I think there's a kind of structure to storytelling, and I think it's universal. So it's useful in both forms to keep track of. Each card represents a scene, and that you can. The reason you do them on cards is you can move the cards around. You can change the order and the position.
You can play 52 pickup,
For example.
So tell us. So what is the story? You said there's an story, a way of telling.
No, there's an structure.
Structure, yes.
Which is, it's classic 3-act structure. The way Patty Chayefsky put it is, Act 1, you get your character up a tree. Act 2, you throw rocks at him. Act 3, you get him down from the tree. So, in one way or another, that's the 3-act.
Okay, so since you mentioned acts and piggybacking on Leslie's comment, I was very touched and moved by how well you convey males' sensitivity in males. And I know you just had a play open back east. So I'm curious about the difference between using words to describe the feelings as opposed, I don't know if it's an opposed, the difference or continuity between that and using action on the stage.
No, that's a really interesting question.
Could you repeat the question? Wait, in short.
You're really putting me on the spot. And then you leave, Sam. Thank you very much. What a coward. Oh, there you are. No, the question was, tell me if I'm paraphrasing this correctly. What are the differences between expressing emotion or telling a story on stage or in the pages of a book? And in a way, the play I just wrote is a misleading example of, or exemplar of the difference, because it's one character talking. So in a way, I could have almost written it as a short story, or even a short novel. But in general, I mean, one of the things I really like about novels is you create the whole world with words. And on the stage, I mean, somebody with my first novel, actually it was with the manner of the book, somebody said to me, you don't write like a screenwriter. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, you actually describe things. Most screenwriters, even when they're writing a novel, just put the dialogue in because they're so used to the director doing the work for them. So I prefer writing in a way where you can create the visual as well as the verbal part of it.
What's it like writing for a sitcom? Tell me. Elaborate on that, will you?
No, well,
which sitcoms were you working?
Well, I did probably close to 100, but the good ones.
I mean,
tend not to mention the bad ones, and I did plenty of those. But I did have multiple episodes of MASH and All in the Family, and the Bob Newhart Show, and the Jeffersons, and I don't know.
So you had to do it every week?
No, I was the freelancer. I would do an episode every once in a while.
But you were under a deadline, right?
Oh, sure.
What was it like? Explain it a little bit.
Well, I mean, the process was, really?
Yeah.
I have to relive this?
People are interested in
I
that.
have to relive this nightmare? because I lived in Berkeley, I would fly down to Los Angeles. I would have a meeting, what they called a pitch meeting, in which I would tell maybe 5 or 6 story ideas. Usually they would buy one, and if not, I had wasted a trip down to Los Angeles, but they would buy one. And then I would have to write an outline, and they would give me notes on the outline. And then I would write a first draft, and they'd give me notes on the first draft. Then I'd write a second draft, and they'd give me notes on the second draft. And then I'd do what they call a polish, and
That's it.
that was it. And I mean, there are so many things that were awful about the process. But one is, it wasn't, finally you didn't own it. And I don't mean that in a financial way. You didn't own it in an emotional or a creative way. You were fitting into somebody else's schema. And they claimed they knew their characters better than you did, and they probably had some justification in thinking that. But they also claimed their aesthetic was the governing aesthetic, and there I think they were probably on thinner ice, but it didn't matter. They had all the power. So it was a grind, and it was sometimes exciting, and it was fun to go down and watch them actually shoot the thing. I mean, I can't deny there was a kind of excitement to that. But it was a little soul-destroying at the same time. And it wasn't, you don't become a writer, I don't think, to put yourself through that kind of grinder.
What about film scripts? What's that like?
Not dissimilar enough. It's better. It's better. They
Don't
give
you
you a
have to write
little.
with a group or something like that?
I never did.
You never did. Okay. But it's different than writing a novel. You said that the problem is they.
Well, you literally don't own it. I mean, you don't own it from a financial point of view.
Right.
You surrender your rights for certain vestigial interests. But in addition, you don't own it creatively.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I mean, I think every writer in Hollywood has had the experience of having written 4 or 5 drafts, conceived the characters, invented the story, and then they hire a director to do it, and then it says a film by, and it's this director who came in at the last minute. And everybody thinks the director is the author of the film. The studio will resolve.
Aren't writers schmucks with typewriters? Isn't that what they said?
Well, that's what Harry Cohn said. And we all know how refined his sense is.
Are there any more questions? Let's open it up. Yeah, sure. Ma'am.
So are you going to, as a prolific writer of different genres, going to join the other throngs and write your own book on writing?
No. I can answer that really quickly.
Why not?
I think they're largely useless. There's a character in The Adventures of Augie March who says to Augie, if it doesn't come easily, it doesn't come at all. And it's not that, I mean, developing your talent takes really hard work. But I think if you don't have that sine qua non to begin with, all the work in the world isn't going to help you that much. And I don't know that a book about how to do it is actually going to help anybody.
Ma'am, you had a question.
Can you imagine turning All Our Yesterday into a movie?
Sure. Make me an offer.
I gotta say something. I'm a literary agent, and I have not had a single client who didn't think their book would be a great movie, including, books about hormone therapy.
Hormone therapy would be kind of a cool movie.
It's a great title.
Any other questions? You've already asked. I'll let you.
Hi.
You sure?
Go ahead.
Have you ever turned one of your books into a screenplay?
Yes, but it wasn't produced. It was bought, but not produced. FaceTime was bought by Showtime, and we did several drafts, and they green-lighted it, which I always thought meant they were going to make it, but then somehow they didn't.
And was that a different experience than writing something?
Well, yes, I worked with a very intelligent and sensitive producer, so it was not as much of an ordeal as it sometimes is.
Not as soul stealing.
It was not quite as soul-stealing. But on the other hand, it didn't get produced, so maybe there's a lesson there.
Questions?
I want to make, I know you don't like it, but it's related to a couple of comments that were made about male sensitivity to understanding female characters. I think that one of the things about Erik's books, particularly FaceTime and This Time, that are just brilliant are the periods of heartbreak, or the periods of what it means when a relationship gets in serious trouble. They're so real and they're told from the male's point of view. It's really interesting. I mean, they're basically that devastation that you, whenever I read those passages, I go right back to the, what did you say, 20-year-old blah blah blah.
That blah blah, yeah, blah blah.
The complete and utter devastation that you feel if a relationship goes wrong, and it's told in these books from the point of view of the male. I just think it's a very special thing. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you. You want to get together after the show? No, I want to about that. I just want to say, and it's,
We'll put the check in the mail.
the books aren't autobiographical, but as I tried to say earlier, I do want, when I'm writing, to experience what every character in the book is experiencing. So I try to be honest about it, and that's almost as hard as being honest about yourself, even if you've invented everything, because you really have to face what these characters are facing. And so insofar as I achieve that, I'm delighted, but that's really what I aspire to.
Well, I actually, this is kind of this is my first serious remark today, but I almost thought this book was about me. I mean, I really identified with it, and it had a 3-handkerchief ending, by the way, but I'm not going to give it away. Next, I think this is the last question. Is that
One or two more? Yeah.
2 more questions? Okay, yes.
Well, I'd like to comment that, I know I read the book and I enjoyed it very much, and your understanding of the male psyche is beautifully done. But there is also a character, a girl, and the man deals with her in a beautiful, beautiful fashion, a young girl. And I thought that, do you have a daughter?
No, I have a son. And he's straight.
I thought that.
And he's not a character in the novel.
And he's not in the novel, but thank you.
One more question, that's it? Anybody? Yes.
Comment. It goes back to what you're talking about, writing comedy. I think writing comedy, this is, you know I know nothing about this, but writing comedy.
Can you say something else self-deprecating? I don't think you've been sufficiently self-deprecating.
If you read comic books, they're very often, they don't fully work because the comedy is superimposed. And in your case, the comedy emerges from the action, from inside. It's an interior thing. And the thing comes, and you can't do that unless you have a sense of humor that allows you to do that. And anybody who's had dinner with Erik will know that around the table, he's devastatingly funny, and it just comes out of anything. Anything will cause that humor to come forth. And I think you get that particularly in this book.
But let me say one other thing on that, and it's a tribute to a forerunner. I had always liked reading humor, but joke novels or comic novels always seemed entirely artificial until I read Kingsley Amis, where they were real novels that also happened to be funny. And the first time I read Lucky Jim, I thought that's really what I want to be doing. I mean, insofar as if it's going to be comic, the comedy has to come out of the truth of the story. It can't just be a series of jokes.
I think that's
All right,
it.
I think that's it, unless Leslie has one more question for us.
Well, I
Yeah.
just have one comment. We are at Book Passage are so happy to have Erik in our midst, and he's going to bring some flyers over, and you can tell your friends he'll be appearing at 2 other venues. Whenever you can, support an independent bookstore, buy the book there, because eventually there will be no place to see authors because everyone's buying on Amazon. So it's cheaper, but we really appreciate that you came today, and please support Erik and pass on the great message of what a wonderful writer he is.
Wait a minute, I have to make a pitch too. FaceTime and The Man Who Wrote the Book are both available as ebooks. And by the way, Book Passage sells ebooks now. You don't have to get it from Amazon. And they're for what? They're $3.99. You know. And so you should buy it.
Should buy a ebook from Book Passage. You need to just get a Kobo account through Book Passage. That's all there is to it. And you can use Kobo account on any device. It can be on an iPad. It doesn't have to be on a Kobo device. It's the
Put in your electric razor.
So I just want to reiterate what exactly. I want to restate what Leslie said another way, which is somebody came in here earlier and they said, "Oh, I'm sorry we're here late. Can we pay later?" And I said, No, you don't have to pay. You just come to the event. And that's one of the amazing things. We have these kinds of talented people here every day, And the only way in which apparently Eric takes excuse.
I wouldn't use that line again.
We have these kind of, well, we have amazing folks here day after day. I'll change it a little. But the way you can support them and us is by buying the book, which you can do over here at the counter. Thank you so much for coming. Eric will be up here signing afterwards. So grab a book, come up and he'll sign it.